Well, it's Easter weekend, and here at Grace Point, Easter is a really big deal for us, as it is for so many Christians all around the world. Easter is a time where a lot of people are extra curious about Christianity and about Jesus. And so we know that there are a lot of people who visit churches or might be visiting online that aren't Christians. And if that's you, if you're here today and you're not a Christian, if you're not a Jesus follower, and if you've hung around Grace Point for any period of time, you know that I prefer the term Jesus follower. I don't really say Christian a lot. And it's just because the word Christian in our culture today is just so weighed down with so many different things. And so Jesus follower is really what Christians are about. And so maybe you used to be one. Maybe you grew up being a Christian and for some reason you fell away, or you used to attend a church somewhere and you had a really, really bad experience at the church. Or maybe you never had anything to do with Christianity, but you married someone who was a Christian, or one of your best friends is a Christian, and you've kind of skirted around it. You've been careful to avoid it, but not stayed far away, but not gotten too close. And so if that's you, I want you to know that I completely understand that whatever reason you have for not being Christian is a really, really good reason. I've never met anybody who had a bad reason for not being a Christian. Everyone that I've ever talked to who's explained to me why they don't want to be a Christian had a really, really good reason. And I will bet that if you and I were sitting at a coffee shop somewhere, sitting across the table from each other, and then I said, tell me your story, and you told me your story, if you told me the things that you have heard, the things that you've seen, that if you told me the people that you had met, if you told me the experiences that you had, the churches that you have visited, if you explained to me all of the reasons that come into play for why you're not a Christian, I would listen to what you had to say, and I would think to myself, boy, if I experienced what you experienced, I wouldn't want to be a Christian either. I would make the same decision that you made if I experienced the same things that you've experienced. But if we were sitting across that table from each other, and you said to me, okay, look, I am not a Christian, but I want to give you a shot. So Caesar, I'm just going to tell you right now, let me have it. Give me your best argument, your best reasoning. Give it to me right now. I'm going to be open to it, to considering following Jesus. If you gave me that one shot, let me tell you where I wouldn't start. I wouldn't start by trying to defend the church. Whether it's a church that you visited or the history of the church, that's not where I would start. I wouldn't start with trying to defend Christians or some of the crazy things that we've seen Christians do. I wouldn't even start with the Bible. You know why? Because the question is not, is the Bible true? That doesn't play into why so many of us made the decision to be a Christian. You see, there were followers of Jesus 100, almost 200 years before there was ever a Bible. Before anybody ever put all of these things together and called it a Bible, almost 200 years before that, there were people who were already following Jesus. There were people who were Christians who had never heard of Adam or Eve. They had never heard of Noah or Moses. They had never heard any of those Christian stories that even today in our culture, non-Christians have heard about. See, that is not the issue. The issue is not whether or not the Bible is true. The issue is not the embarrassing, often embarrassing history of the church. The issue is not the behavior or the values or the discrimination of the Christians that you've met along the way. If you were to ask me to give you my best pitch, what I would focus your attention on is simply this. It would be an event where it all started, an event that Christians all over the world are gathering today to celebrate. And that event is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, you know when people started believing in the resurrection of Jesus? Do you know when people started believing that Jesus rose from the dead? They started believing it the morning that Jesus rose from the dead. And they did exactly what any other person would do if they encountered someone who rose from the dead. Especially if this was someone who they saw die, who they knew was buried. And then the next morning, he was on the beach with them having breakfast. They did exactly the same thing that you and I would do. You know what they did? They went on social media. Now, social media today is very different than it was back then. But essentially, what do we do when we see something interesting, when we see something fascinating? Don't we start talking about it? Today we talk a lot in pictures, but isn't that what we do? We start talking about it and we start telling other people about it and we start distributing it. We write it down. Today we, write it this way, but back then they would write it this way and then they would just spread it out to as many people as they could. And this is exactly the same thing that the people in Jesus' time did when they saw Jesus alive again. And so the reason that we as followers of Jesus believe that Jesus rose from the dead isn't because the Bible says so. The reason that we believe that Jesus rose from the dead is because people witnessed it. Because Matthew, who was a person who was at the bottom of society, he was a reject from not just from his family, but from his culture, but from his nation. Matthew, who was a man who saw Jesus and Jesus called him and said, "Matthew, come and follow me." Matthew followed Jesus and wrote about it. We believe that Jesus rose from the dead because a man named Mark, who was a Greek, who followed the disciples of Jesus around and wrote everything that he could about it. He gave us an account of everything that he saw, and he wrote down. We don't believe it because of the Bible. We believe it because there was a man named Luke. Luke, who was a physician, who was a scientist, who was very, very meticulous and articulate, who wrote an entire manuscript, and he started it with these words. He said that I have decided to write an orderly account of everything that I have witnessed, of everything that has happened among us. See, we believe it because of a man named John, who was an eyewitness who looked into the empty tomb where Jesus was and he no longer was. We believe it because of a man named Peter, who was one of Jesus' closest friends, one of his disciples, who would write about it because he saw it firsthand. And he would later on write letters to the churches that had popped up all over the known world, telling them about the resurrection of Jesus. We believe it because of a man named James, who was the half-brother of Jesus, who while Jesus was alive wasn't a Jesus follower. But after Jesus died and rose again, and James experienced that Jesus was alive again, he became one of the leaders of the churches. He became the head of the home church in Jerusalem. We believe it because of a man named Paul. Paul, who was responsible for planting so many brand new Christian churches all throughout the Roman Empire. Paul, who not just Christians, but historians, non-Christian historians from other faiths acknowledge that there was a man named Paul who did all of these things and who wrote all about Jesus, who wrote most of what we today call the New Testament. We believe it because of him. And we also believe it from one of the most unlikely places, but from a man named Nero. Now, Nero was an emperor, one of the emperors of Rome. And we have come to believe that Jesus rose from the dead because of all of these men who witnessed it, but also because of this man Nero, who did not believe that Jesus rose from the dead, or was not a testimony of Jesus rising from the dead because he believed in the Bible. We believe it because all those people before him, the people that I mentioned before him, wrote about it, and people believed what those people wrote. And so here was Nero, who was an emperor of Rome. And many of you have heard the name Nero. Nero is not an unfamiliar name to you. But I will bet that those of you who know the name Nero don't know any of the major laws that he passed. You don't know any of the wars that he won. You don't know anything about who his famous mother was or how he became emperor, because his biological father was not the emperor. He didn't inherit it that way. But there are two things that you and I have heard in popular culture that we probably remember from history classes when we were in high school. There are two things that we know about Nero. One of them was that Nero burned down Rome. And the second thing that we know is that when everybody got angry about Nero burning down Rome, he blamed the Christians and persecuted the Christians for the anger that people had felt about the fire that Nero had started. This is not the Bible telling us this. This is history. Historians have told us that this is what happened. Now, do you know why it is that Nero could persecute Christians 30 years after the resurrection? 30 years after the Jesus rising from the dead, that Nero could be persecuting Christians in Rome. Do you know why that was? Well, it's simple. It's because there were Christians in Rome. There were Christians in Rome. Now, scientists and historians, what they tell us is this, that it takes about 60 to 80 years for a story to become a legend, for a myth to become a legend. And the reason that it takes that long is because in order for it to become a legend, in order for it to start getting blown out of proportion or for the story to change, one thing has to happen. You know what that one thing is? Well, it's actually pretty simple. It's that all the original eyewitnesses of the event have to start dying off. And so that's why it takes about 60 to 80 years. In fact, one of the things that was where in recent years that we actually heard about this is a few years ago that people were starting to write that what would happen is that with the Holocaust, that about 60 years after the Holocaust, people would begin to doubt that it actually happened. And even though today you can go to the concentration camps, you can witness what they went through, to see the places that they were at, there are pictures of it. But even today, people are starting to doubt whether or not the Holocaust was true. And the reason is because the eyewitnesses have started to disappear. But that theory began circulating, that maybe there never was a Holocaust. And so it takes about 60 to 80 years for us to get to that point because all of the eyewitnesses were gone. But you see, there were thousands of Christians, some say tens of thousands of Christians, who believed that Jesus rose from the dead, who were living in Rome, who were living in the capital city of the empire, and they believed this long before there was anything in anybody's hand called a Bible. Now, this is not in Jerusalem where this whole movement started. It's not in Judea, the area next to it. It's not in Samaria, the area around that. It was in Rome. It was 1,500 miles away. And you couldn't just fly there like you can do today. It was a long way away, and the people who were believing this were not Jews. They were Romans, Roman citizens living in the city of Rome, who read these accounts and believed that Jesus rose from the dead. So if you were to ask me, I wouldn't start with defending the church. I wouldn't start with trying to defend organized religion. I wouldn't even start by trying to defend the Bible. I would start with what the people who firsthand experienced seeing Jesus live, die, and then experiencing him rise from the dead. I would start with what those people wrote about their experiences. Now, over time, all of that social media that they had created, the manuscripts and the letters that the people who were the eyewitnesses had written, they were all collected together. and they all formed what we call today our New Testament in the Scriptures. And then they did this really, really weird thing, which we don't really even think about today, but it's kind of offensive when you really think about it. Because what they did was they took the Jewish Scriptures, and to the Jewish people, they are not the Old Testament, but today that's what we call it. They took the Jewish Scriptures and they bundled them together with all of these writings from the people who had experienced firsthand Jesus. And they took the Jewish Scriptures and they called that the Old Testament. And then they took all of these writings and they called that the New Testament. And then they wrapped some leather around it, and that became what we know today as the Bible. And so that's how we have all of that together. But you see, it is not just the fact of the resurrection, the fact that it actually happened. That's really not what we're celebrating. What we are celebrating are the implications of what it means that Jesus rose from the dead. And so today, for our Easter celebration, what I want to do is I want to tell you a story of Easter, a story about a really, really sweet moment that happened on Easter morning. And that's our invitation to enter into this story. And so, like I said, that people had collected all of these accounts that these men had wrote about their experiences with Jesus. And there was some evidence that the first grouping of documents that was put together were the first 10 letters that the Apostle Paul had wrote, and that they had bound those together. Those were the very first things at about 100 years after Jesus was born, that was the first time that those were bound together. And then later on, the church fathers Jerome and Augustine would acknowledge that there were actually 27 books that would make up the entire canon, the entire New Testament part of the Scriptures. As did subsequent councils in Hippo and in Carthage that would confirm that these 27 documents, these 27 manuscripts and letters were going to be what would come to be the New Testament. And then by the 4th century, it had been completely settled that scholars and theologians had processed this over hundreds of years to firmly establish what would be the New Testament that would be in both Greek and Latin churches. And then that's when someone had that brilliant idea of taking the Jewish Scriptures and binding them together and adding it to the New Testament, and that was what our Bible is today. That's how it all came together. But the implications, not just the fact that it happened, but the implications of the resurrection impact every area of our lives. It impacts how we spend our time. It impacts who we spend our time with. It impacts how we entertain ourselves. It impacts how we mourn over the loss of people. It impacts how we love people. And so that's why the story of Easter is a story of the death of Jesus. But as we're going to see, it's the story of death defeated. Now, to give you a little bit of context before we start the story, at this time in history where this happens, right about the time that Jesus was living and after he had died and had been resurrected, the Jews who were living at this time had been told for 400 years that a Messiah, a person that was going to save them, was coming. There were prophecies from way back in the Jewish Scriptures that explained that there was going to be a Messiah who had come. And over the years, other people had come up that the Jewish people thought was a Messiah. Now, Rome didn't care because Jerusalem, Judea, that whole area, that was like the backwoods of the Roman Empire. It was not that important to Rome. And they had already experienced over the years, over hundreds of years, several times that these saviors, these messiahs of Israel would rise up. And their stories were always exactly the same way. They were usually a political or a military leader. They would rally support together. They would give this vision of the future about a completely different Israel, an Israel that would return back to the glory days of the greatest king of Israel, King David, who at the time had the greatest kingdom on earth, which was Israel, or maybe even to the kingdom of David's son Solomon, which was the wealthiest kingdom that the earth had ever known up until that time. And so they would paint this picture of an Israel that would return back to that greatness. But in the end, politics and wars and time took their toll on all of these messiahs and on all of these people who claimed to be the Messiah. And it took their toll on the people of Israel, because nothing changed. And here they were in Rome, and Rome was the eternal empire. And Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome, was the son of a god, is what they would say. And there was no chance that this little backwoods place would ever be of any prominence in the Roman Empire. But you see, 2,000 years before Jesus, 2,000 years before that, God went to a man named Abraham. And God said to Abraham, Abraham, I am going to bless you with a family. He had no children. God said, I'm going to bless you with a family. I am going to bless you with a family, and that family is going to become a nation. And out of that nation, I am going to bless the entire world. And this was a foreign concept, because back in that time, nations did not bless other nations. Nations conquered other nations. Nations enslaved other nations. Nations raided other nations. Nations stole from other nations. But no nation ever blessed another nation. In fact, even today, with very, very few exceptions, that doesn't happen. But God said to Abraham, listen, I'm going to give you a family, and your family is to become a nation. And that nation is going to bless all the other nations. And so you fast forward 2,000 years, and here are the descendants of the family of Abraham. And they are in this little backwoods place under the authority of the Roman Empire. And there's no chance in their eyes of Israel ever being able to bless other nations. And so this is where our story starts. It starts with a man named John. They called him John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist. And John was kind of a crazy man. He was like somebody you would see who had been living in the woods for most of their life, and then all of a sudden just came out, right? His hair was all over the place. He was really dirty. He smelled funny. He talked really, really loud. And he was not very politically correct, so he would just speak his mind and say it no matter who he offended. And John went out and he started to preach. And this interesting thing happened, that he wasn't all pretty and cleaned up. He didn't have a big, huge, beautiful church, or he wasn't on TV. He wasn't even online. And yet John would go out into the public and he would preach, and people followed him. They wanted to hear what he was preaching. And they started to think, wait, maybe this might be the guy. Maybe this is the person that we have been waiting for. And so John, one day, he is down in the Jordan River, and he is baptizing people. And this is a brand new concept, because back then, people did not baptize each other as a religious ceremony. There was something that was remotely related to baptism, where you would go into the water and ceremonially cleanse yourself, but you did it to yourself. There was nowhere up until the time of John that anybody baptized somebody else. And so here is John, and he's at the Jordan River, and he is preaching to the crowds. He's preaching to huge crowds. And then he calls them down, and he's going to baptize them. So there he is. He's standing by the edge of the river. There are people all around him. There are kids that are playing off and running around all over the place. And he's in the river baptizing people, just putting them under the water and baptizing them. And as he's doing that, I think he kind of senses something. And so he looks down the road, and he sees a man coming. And as the man gets closer, he looks at him and he recognizes him. And he says to all of the people who are listening to him, he points at the man and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God. He comes to take away the sins of the world." And he began to preach and to teach about Jesus. And it was from there that Jesus went on and people started to follow Jesus. And Jesus went and he preached. And Jesus went and he taught. And the more that he preached and the more that he taught, the more people followed him. And the number of people who were following him were starting to grow. And people began to be alarmed. Not the people who were following him, but the religious leaders in Jerusalem were starting to be alarmed. And the reason was very, very simple. It was that they were starting to look to this man Jesus to hear what God had to say, when before Jesus, people would go to them to hear what God had to say. They were the important ones. And as Jesus became more popular, as more people started to listen to what he had to say, it threatened their popularity and it threatened their power. And they didn't like that. And so they kept an eye on Jesus. They would follow him around and they would ask him questions, trying to trip him up, trying to get him to say something that they could go, "Aha! I knew it. That's not in the scriptures. You're not from God." But they could never do it. They could never find a way to catch him. And so they said, "We've got to do something about this guy." They just kept following him around, kept trying to catch him. Until one day, something happened. Rumors started to circulate about Jesus raising a man named Lazarus from the dead, a wealthy man, a well-known man. This could not have been something that was just made up. It wasn't a random person. Imagine someone in your community who was very, very wealthy and very, very well-known, who passed away and then was raised back to life. It would be easier to do that with someone who was unknown, but this man was very, very well known. And so people who had witnessed this, who had witnessed the man as he was dead and then witnessed him living again, they started to tell other people, and eventually that got around to these religious leaders, that this man from Bethany was risen from the dead by Jesus. And so the Sanhedrin was called. It was essentially the equivalent of the Supreme Court here today for us. And the chief priests and this whole group of religious leaders were called together. A group of people who normally didn't come together. Because even the religious leaders had different groups and they normally didn't see eye to eye. But one thing they did recognize was this: if we don't do something right now, the entire world is going to believe in Jesus. We have got to stop this. So they came up with a plan. And they came up with that plan and they executed that plan exactly how they wanted it to go. And so Jesus was betrayed. And he was unrighteously condemned. And then he was crucified. And then he was buried. And two very, very wealthy, very prominent men, two religious leaders, who while Jesus was alive, they were following Jesus, but they were secret followers. Nobody knew that they were followers of Jesus because they didn't want to risk their positions because of their support of Jesus. But once Jesus died, these two men somehow got the courage to go to the governor of the area, to go to Pilate, and ask for the body of Jesus. Now see, when someone is crucified in that time, they don't give the body to the family after the person has died. That was not allowed. They took the body and they would either throw it in a trash dump or they would throw it into a pile and burn it. But the bodies never went back to the families. The body of a person who was crucified was not allowed to be buried. But these two men, they went to Pilate. They probably had to bribe him. And they asked for the body of Jesus. And as the sun was setting, they went and they took the body of Jesus. And they went to the tomb. And there they hastily prepared Jesus' body for burial. You see, it was Friday and the sun was setting. And as was the custom of the Jewish people, as was the custom of Jesus, Sabbath starts on Friday at sunset. And so they had to quickly, before the sun set, prepare Jesus' body because Sabbath was about to begin. And so they prepared his body, and then they sealed the tomb, and then they left. And on that day, the day that Jesus died, everybody unfollowed Jesus. That's right. He had no more Instagram followers, no more Facebook followers. Now, we use those terms today. But back then, they did similar things. Jesus is gone. No reason to keep up with him anymore. So here's Jesus' followers. They watched Jesus die. The people who were closest to him. They either watched him die or they were so embarrassed that they went away and heard that he was dead. They saw him experience the pain of the torture that he experienced and knew his fate. And when Jesus died, the movement that he started died with him. There was no more movement to follow. There was no more message that was worth repeating. And you see, when Jesus died, all of his followers, they left. They took off. Because no one expected Jesus to rise again. They weren't standing outside his tomb on Sunday morning going, all right, 5 more minutes. Do I have time to go to the bathroom? Do I have time to grab a cup of coffee? No, it's going to be here. We got to wait. No one was expecting it. When Jesus died, they believed that the mission died. And the reason they believed that is because unlike all of those other people who had come before, Jesus claimed to be the mission. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so how can he die if he's the way, the truth, and the life? Jesus would say, I am the resurrection and the life. How can you be the life if you're dead? Jesus would say, I am the Son of Man, which at that time was an acknowledgement, saying something significant, that phrase that meant there is something about God in me. In fact, he would basically infer that he was the Son of God. That he was, when people would say, is this the Messiah? It was almost like he was giving them a wink. You finally figured it out. But if he is the real Messiah that all of the prophets prophesied, how could he be crucified? How could he be dead? And so even before he died, Jesus' closest followers went into hiding. One of his closest followers, Peter, when asked, who am I? He would say, you are the Christ, you are the anointed one. And yet, just hours later, people would ask him, don't you know Jesus? And he would say, no, I don't even know who that guy is. And if you look at all of the rest of them, they all had the same story. There were no heroes here. There was no one saying, no, I know that you think he's dead, but this isn't the end of the story. All of those people who were following Jesus thought this was the end of the story. Which brings us to the part of the story that we are going to talk about today, that I want to talk to you about today, because this moment happens in the in-between time. It happens in the Saturday, the time that was the day of rest, the time where the Jewish people observed the Sabbath, that Jesus even observed the Sabbath, and that on that day he rested. So it was in this time where we find ourselves in this story. And in this story, everyone who was there, everyone who was a Jesus follower, everyone who was not a Jesus follower, no one there expected there to be a resurrection. And that's where our story begins. This is John's account of it, and he writes this. He says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. And so he's now talking about, because the day starts on sunset, so this is actually Saturday towards the evening, and it's dark, it's early on that first day. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. And so Mary was a person who knew Jesus, who was very, very close to Jesus, someone whose words made a difference in her life. And so Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb because she was very grateful for everything that Jesus had done for her. And like you and maybe and like many, many people, she believed that Jesus was a teacher, that he was a rabbi, that he was a miracle doer. He did miracles, that he befriended people who most religious people wouldn't be friends with. She believed that there was something about him. She knew that this was a person who was sent from God. But yet on that Easter morning, she believed that he was dead. And like all of his followers, she believed that he would stay dead. And so on Easter morning, she believed about Jesus what maybe you believe about him, that he died. And that was the end of the story. But Mary went to the tomb. And John writes that she went there and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Now, as we know, Jesus was crucified. And then he was taken down from the cross on Friday afternoon. And then the two men, Nicodemus and a man named Joseph of Arimathea, they took his body. They bribed the governor. And they took his body and brought him to this tomb. And they did their best, as that they could to wrap his body, to wrap him in cloth, to prepare him for burial. And they tried to get it all done before sunset because that was the beginning of the Sabbath. And what they expected was that what would happen with Jesus was the same thing that would happen with everybody who was buried in a tomb. That they would close up the tomb and that the body would stay there for a couple of years, several years, until eventually the body would decompose and there would be nothing left but bones. And then someone would gather those bones and put them in a box and it would stay on somebody's mantle somewhere. Next to their Christmas stockings. That's just where you would put it. And so Mary was going there, and Mary was carrying everything that she needed to re-embalm the body of Jesus. And I think this is funny because Mary was probably thinking, okay, two guys are going to go do this. They're going to just mess it up. So I know that I need to come back and do it after them. And so she had all of the stuff that she needed to redo what these two guys tried to do real quick on Friday. And that wouldn't have been a pleasant task. Because here would have been a body that would already have been starting to compose. And it would have been a body that, according to Jewish tradition and custom at the time, that if she were to touch that body now, that she would be unclean for 7 days. That she would be ceremonially unclean. That there were a lot of complicated things that she had to do because she had touched that body. But she also had a love for the man named Jesus that compelled her and compelled those who were with her to go and do this. To go and do this for him. And when Mary went there and the stone was gone and the tomb was empty, she did not assume that Jesus came back to life. She did not assume that a miracle had happened. She assumed the same thing that you and I would have assumed. She assumed that there was a grave robber, that somebody had come and stole the body of Jesus, which is weird because usually grave robbers rob the body. They don't usually steal the body. There was no thought here that there was a resurrection. Mary, even in John's account, he says that when Mary saw that the tomb was empty, she was alarmed. He goes on and he says, so she, Mary, came running to Simon Peter, one of the disciples, and the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved. And this is fascinating to me because the person that John is talking about here, the other disciple, the one that Jesus loved, is John. That's John. From the other Gospels, we read that John was the one that Jesus loved. And so John is, kind of putting himself into the story without really using his name. So he says, so she came running to Peter and she came running to that other guy that Jesus loved and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him. See, her understanding was that if Jesus' body wasn't there, someone must have taken his body and put him somewhere else. And so Peter and John, they ran to the tomb to take a look. And they saw that it was empty. So they returned back to the city, maybe to get together with some of the other followers of Jesus who were there to try to figure out where they could have taken Jesus' body. But Mary, instead, what she did was she stayed at the tomb. She stayed there. In verse 10, it tells us that the disciples went back to where they were staying. See, they went back, but not Mary, right? Mary has come back. She's confused. She's lost. She's broken. She's still at the tomb. The sun is just starting to come up. And John tells us, now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. That's hours later. And she's still crying. Not just because of the death of Jesus, but because she was even denied the opportunity to prepare his body for death. And she couldn't help but think, God didn't come through. And it didn't work out. And then I put my faith in Jesus, and Jesus is gone. Where am I going to put my faith in now? Who am I going to trust now? Now listen, this is a place that all of us have experienced. All of us get to this place where we question everything and we think to ourselves, man, I don't know. I don't know who am I going to put my trust in. I'm not sure that I can put my trust in God. What if I do and he lets me down? So Mary was experiencing many of the same questions that you and I have experienced. Maybe they're questions that you are experiencing right now. John continues and says that as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. Now, she didn't know they were angels. She just saw two people in the tomb, sitting there. And they asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? You're crying. Why? Tell us why you're crying." And this is what Mary says. She says, "They have taken my Lord away. They've taken his body. And I don't know where they have put him." So she's having conversation with these people. And then listen to what happens. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. She turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. And I think Jesus would have looked at her, and he may have been there for a while overhearing this conversation, watching her crying and watching these two angels who were there asking her why she was crying and hearing her explain that she was crying because she was mourning over Jesus. And I think Jesus would have looked at her and would have had a little smile on his face. Because Jesus would know that she was just moments away from everything that she had thought changing. Everything becoming new again. Because he knew that the knowledge that Jesus, that he was alive, was going to change everything. And so Jesus says, he asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for?" Right? Because that's what you would do if someone asked if you were looking for somebody and the person you were looking for was there, but you didn't recognize them, right? Say, "Hey, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" And then in this next verse, this is the hilarious part. Because this is a story that Mary would be asked about over and over again her entire life. And I think that Mary, when she tells this story, she's going to tell this story, and the way she's going to tell it, it's going to be one of the funniest stories that she would ever be able to tell. And when you read it, if you read it in the context of what was going on, it's actually pretty hilarious. Because it says, when Jesus says, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you were looking for?" It says, Mary, thinking he was the gardener. Right? Can you imagine her years later? People would say, Mary, tell us the story again." So there I am. I'm standing outside the tomb. I'm crying because I don't know Jesus. I don't know that Jesus is still alive. I'm talking to these guys who were sitting on the tomb. And then I look back and there he is. And I thought he was the gardener. I thought he was there to mow the lawn. But it was actually Jesus. No one was expecting that. And so it says, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away," in other words, if you're the guy who took the body of Jesus, "tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And it says, Jesus said to her, Mary. And there must have been something in his tone. Maybe there was something in his demeanor. There was something very, very familiar about how this man that she thought was the gardener, how this man said her name. And so Jesus says, Mary, and instantly something changed in Mary. And she says, she turned toward him and cried it out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher, rabbi, Rabboni. And she must have started to run towards him because Jesus says, do not come hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. He says, go instead to my brothers and tell them. And he says, he's now telling him, go back to the people who we used to hang out with together. Go back to the people who used to follow me. Go back to the people who I've been closest with. Go back, and I want you to tell them this. I am ascending to my Father and your Father. There's something about God that we're in this together. I am ascending to my Father and your Father. I am ascending to my God and your God. Go tell them that. And then John writes that Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news. She probably sprinted towards the disciples with the news. And she cried out, I have seen the Lord. And that was her second trip there. The first time she went there to say, someone stole the body. And then the second time she goes to say, I have seen the Lord. He is alive. He is risen. See, God did come through. It did work out. And Mary knew who she could trust. See, Easter is the story of death. It's the story of the death of Jesus. But while it is the story of death, it is also the story of death defeated. See, nothing else in the world had changed. Rome was still Rome. The people were still the people. Her relationships had not changed. Her finances had not changed. Her health had not changed. Everything in her life was exactly the same. Nothing in the world around her had changed, but she had changed. And the reason that she changed is because Jesus was alive. And she saw it and she believed it. And that changed everything for Mary. And if you are a follower of Jesus, you know that that changes everything for you. It's changed everything for you. And if you are not yet a follower of Jesus, then I want you to know that it has the potential to change everything for you. You see, if someone has the temerity to claim and predict his own death and predict his resurrection, and then actually goes through with it, actually does it, is actually able to accomplish it, then I think that that is a person that we can put our trust in and trust what that person has to say. And so because of the resurrection, because we have so many eyewitness accounts that have survived, that were written by people who saw Jesus, who saw him live, who watched him die, and then who saw him walking around the cities, walking on the beach, having breakfast with him. When they saw that, they believed in the resurrection of Jesus. And so because of the resurrection of Jesus, 2,000 years later, you and I, we can pray knowing that God hears our prayers. We can live knowing that there is a life beyond this life. And we can sacrifice knowing that our faithfulness matters. See, Jesus was the one who taught us, who for the very first time in history allowed us this opportunity to address God not as the mighty creator of the universe, which he was, not the God who is all-knowing and all-seeing and all-powerful, which he is, but he's the one who said, no, wait a second. He is all those things, but I want you to know, he is also your heavenly Father. He looks at you like a perfect father looks at a child. And Jesus taught us that not only does God hear our prayers, but he even knows all of the things that we're going to pray for. He knows all the things that we need even before you and I ask. And it was Jesus who said that he was going to go to the Father and to prepare a place for you and me. It was Jesus who said over and over again that everything that we do in this life on behalf of Him, everything that we do in order to introduce more people to Him, everything that we do to get more people to see who He really is going to be rewarded. We're going to be rewarded for that in the future. And it's because of the resurrection that if you have never put your faith in Jesus, if you've never made that decision to put your faith in Jesus as your Savior, that you should at least consider it. See, this isn't about whether or not Christians are perfect, because they're not. I don't have to tell you that. You know that. But as one of them, I can tell you, we're not. It's not about, is the church perfect? Because the church is full of imperfect Christians, and so the church is going to be imperfect too. We're going to make mistakes. See, the real issue is this. The real issue is, who is Jesus? Was Jesus just a good teacher? Someone who made an impact that lasted a long time? Well, some people believe that. But on Easter, as we celebrate Easter, that question of who is Jesus is answered. Because Jesus is exactly who He claimed to be. He claimed to be our Savior. He claimed to be our Lord. He claimed to be the one to defeat death. And that is exactly what happened, and that is exactly what He did. And I believe that that is worth your consideration of being a follower of Jesus. And one of the songs that we listened to during our worship time was a song called Lord, I Need You. And in that song, it kind of says in a few short verses the implication to us today about the resurrection of Jesus. Because you see, the resurrection of Jesus isn't just an event that happened, although it was. And it wasn't just the focal point, the thing that jump-started Christianity, although it was. But it's the implications of the resurrection of Jesus. Because what Jesus said to us was that because of His broken body and because of His shed blood, that the sins that you and I have in us, the sins that we have committed in the past, the sins that we're doing right now, all of the sins that we're going to do in the future, that they are all covered by His blood. And that because we have a heavenly Father whose standard is perfection, and because you and I are human and we could never ever reach that standard, Jesus said, I am going to step in and I am going to make it so that you don't have to meet that standard. That you become righteous, that you become holy, that you become set apart, not because of anything that you have done, but because everything that I, Jesus, have done for you. That we don't have to earn our way back to God, that we don't have to do enough so that God will love us. But that God loves you and me just as we are right now. And so when the song says this, where sin runs deep, which it does, your grace is more. And where grace is found, that is where you are. And where you are, Lord, I am free. And it ends, holiness, righteousness, goodness in the eyes of God comes because of Christ in me. It's a wonderful thing to be able to know that we can stop running, that we can stop working hard, that we can stop trying, that you don't have to break that habit, that you don't have to stop doing that thing, you don't have to clean up your life, that Jesus loves you just as you are right now. And you can take and accept that. And it doesn't cost you a thing, but it brings into your life everything. So listen, if you are watching us today, if you are watching this video right now, and you want to make that decision to place your faith and trust in Jesus, if you want to make that decision that, listen, maybe I'm not sure exactly where it's leading, and I'm not sure exactly yet if I believe the whole thing, but here's what I know. I want to stick close to Jesus. I want to follow Jesus. If that is you, then would you do me a favor? Would you let us know in the comments or let us know in the chat? And if you don't want to do it that way, you could send a direct message to the church, or you can email me at pastor@wearegracepoint.com. It's right down there. Or there's a link to our connection card, online connection card, and you can do it there too. But would you just let me know? Let me know, because not so that I can pressure you, but I'd really like to pray for you. And I'd like to be available to answer any questions that you might have and talk to you about what your next step might be. So again, let us know in the comments or in the chat, or email me directly at pastor@wearegracepoint.com. Listen, I hope that you guys enjoy the rest of your Easter weekend. It is a wonderful time, and it's a great time for us as followers of Jesus to be able to remember this beautiful gift that Jesus gave us. This beautiful gift of something that we could never reach for ourselves. That because of his broken body and because of his shed blood, that God the Father looks at us the same way that he looks at Jesus. That we are righteous not because of what we do, but because of what Jesus has already done.